Okay, could I now invite the representatives from Lothian Buses to come forward, please? And I think the convener is minded to ask the representatives to address the motion by Councillor Mayne that was considered at the previous committee on the 16th first, and then we'll move on to item 7.15.
Clearly, you may not directly have Councillor Mayne's motion in front of you, gentlemen, but essentially the key thrust of it was contained in those questions that were sent in a written format as requested by the committee to yourselves. Okay, thank you. Just by way of introduction, yes, we have Jim McFarlane here as chair of Lothian Bus, for those who haven't met Jim before, and Richard Hall, obviously here as managing director. Thank you. Jim, would you like to start? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, convener, and good morning, committee. Convener, in the letter you issued to Richard inviting him to attend today, you also extended that invitation to me if I could. When I read the minutes of the committee's last meeting, I thought I should attend. I thought the motions were very balanced. It was good to have recognised that Lothian Buses is amongst the most successful bus operators in the UK. And as part of that, we do value very highly customer service. Earlier this year, the independent body Transport Focus undertook one of their regular reviews of bus passenger feelings. And in response to the question, how satisfied are you with the overall quality of the journey, our passengers gave the company a response of 95% being very satisfied or satisfied. And that was up from 93% in 2016. And I think that says a lot for the company, given the complexity of our network, the challenges we face in relation to things like congestion and journey times. And to you, convener, and the committee, assurances from me and the board that we do take customer views very, very seriously. And if any group of customers, passengers, or even individuals express concerns, then I entirely believe that we have a duty to listen and to respond. So Richard will now outline how that response is evolving to the issues that were raised in the petition at your last meeting.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you, convener, committee. Thanks for letting us speak to you today. It's important to give some context around it. I've provided a response directly to convener on the 4 questions that were asked at the last committee, but it's important to give you some context today about the journey that we're on, which will play out, I would hope, where we're trying to go to. You'll see on the screens in front of you a slide that's come up. I've only got 5 slides, which I'm going to talk to and give some wider context within the time that I've been allocated today. And the title's about improving accessibility, which is Lothian's journey, and that really is a journey we're on. And that journey is driven by lots of things. As our chair said this morning, we listen to customers all the time. We're re-establishing ourselves as a customer-focused delivery organisation rather than a bus company. And that's key critical, and that's perhaps historic why Lothian has been successful for many, many years and continues to evolve its model, because we're in the cusp of a massive piece of socio-economic change at the moment. And if we don't adapt as a bus operator, as a public transport operator, we will wither on the vine. We have to do that. So to give you some direct context, if we can go to the next slide. Okay. You see in front of you, and I'm not going to baffle you with science or hide behind any legal context, But this slide is very demonstrative, I would hope, in terms of demonstrating 5 red circles, okay, that are marked up as critical risk seating and zones. And this is really, really where it all started some 18 months, 2 years ago, around how we move forward from this position. And that demonstrates a typical historic vehicle that we've purchased. It has this one, and not all of our historic vehicles have 2 spaces, one that is mandatory under legislation that's been driven by the DfD for a wheelchair, and one that is optional in terms of a buggy or other goods. And I may make that point about other goods. That could be objects that are being carried, could be a mobility frame, etc., etc. Those 5 critical risk seating areas are the largest area of claim we have in our business, and our customers and our passengers' safety is key critical to what we do. Not only as a commercial organisation, but we're bound very, very heavily by legislative control and requirements that we have to satisfy as directors of the business. That's both executive and non-executive directors, and also requirements that we have to hold as transport managers, where we have to justify that to the Traffic Commissioner for Scotland. So we set along a path about how do we reduce these, and that was primarily driven by a very serious incident where, unfortunately, an elderly female passenger was sitting on one of the seats. So you can see on the bottom edge of the bus in the diagram, there's a red ring on its own, and then there's the designation of a buggy on the floor tile and 2 seats behind. And she was sitting in these 2 seats behind, and the bus braked in a controlled braking measure. The lady was actually fairly infirm. She had some mobility issues, and sadly she was catapulted forward from that seat through the designated area where there's a buggy marked on the floor, through the wheelchair area, and hit the front wheel box with her head. She suffered a depressed skull fracture in this incident, and some weeks later died in hospital, very sadly. And any incident where there's a fatality or a serious injury on a bus is something that's very serious. It's something we're working towards, how we achieve 0 injuries and fatalities in terms of our vision. That is only one. That's the most serious. There's currently a very large court action going on with that, and we will be moving through that as appropriate. So that set us on a path about how we reduce that. If we can move on to the next slide, I will demonstrate where we are today. And this is the new bus that has been subject of much debate. And you can see we've gone from 5 critical risk seats to 1. And that's massive. And this is not about often what the bus driver does. We train them to very, very high standards. This is often about the mobility issues that, a customer, any customer of any age group may have. Moving on a bus is quite difficult. We know that. People often get up. They often don't sit down before the bus moves away. So we have to be very aware of that. What you will see that drawing also demonstrates is a number of areas, 3 areas that are marked out in yellow, and they are areas where traditionally you would have only seen a metal type frame, what we would call hand poles in a bus, where a customer could either injure themselves on that frame or be propelled through the structure because it was a loose structure. So these have been built up. They've got actual solid material in them. And as a result, we've reduced those points down to 1. You will see in that bus, and this is the bus we're talking about today, the subject of discussion at the last committee, that the bay that was traditionally the wheelchair bay has been extended in its length, and it now contains space to take both a wheelchair and a buggy, albeit the space is slightly less than the space that was provided on the diagram before. But I make point of the fact that actually that was only a very small volume of buses that had that. So we're moving to a position of a safer layout for buses. There's other things that drive that, and changing legislation from the DFT is driving this as well. So behind the red circle, you see on the top of that diagram, you've got 2 double seats. Both of those double seats are what are termed as priority seats. They have to be provided by law. They have to be in a defined area with defined access. Legislation changed again about 12 months ago, where 2 of those 4 seats have to become dog accessible. And they have to become dog accessible in as much that the space in front of the seat is increased, and you can see that on the front pair of seats on the top line, and you have to increase the space below those seats so the dog can sit below the seats. And that's around the growth of what we would traditionally term as guide dogs into assistance dogs. And there's currently 14 types of assistance dogs. So we're articulating a path of the journey we're going into. You might ask why we haven't got a, what would be defined as some people as a designated buggy space on there, because the construction of the bus does not allow it. Not only the physical construction, but some of the requirements we need to meet under the DFT guidance. Where do we go in the future? And this is perhaps where the process of evolution is going to. So phase 2, as I've discussed with the convener, is a review of our conditions of carriage. And that's actually been completed already since the last committee. They were quite historic, needed a full review. We've done that. And out of that, we've done a number of other sessions now around how do we provide guidance for drivers. And all the drivers are trained when they come into the business, but as you can imagine, 30, 40 years on, evolution happens. We do that through top-up training, but this is a very different subject. So this is about how do we board a passenger, a customer, any type of passenger or customer, so that they feel that they have free passage. So they don't feel that, there's an obstacle to boarding the vehicle. So we're doing a set of driver guides. We're doing those around a number of things. We haven't quite completed them as yet. There will probably be 7 or 8 of them, and that's around things like use of buggies and pushchairs, use of wheelchairs, use of mobility scooters, and we don't currently allow mobility scooters on our buses at all. And that was a subject of much debate, I believe, at committee a number of years ago. And the company said that they wouldn't do that. At that time, there was a debate in the national industry as well, and CPT, which is our trade organisation, agreed a code of conduct around scooter use. We've now agreed with CPT in the last couple of weeks that we will adopt that code of conduct from when we publish our updated conditions of carriage. So we will allow, at that point, up to Class 2 mobility scooters on our buses, which is a huge step forward in terms of wider accessibility. Aligning with these driver guides, there will be a set of almost duplicated customer guides that customers can download in PDFs from our websites. They can request for us to send them out, or they can request to come in and be taken through them. And this is key. So this is about breaking down barriers. So we will offer any customer the opportunity to come in, be assessed in terms of the type of equipment they may use. That has to meet certain legal requirements. Wheelchair sizes are stipulated clearly in terms of the access requirements, boarding a bus, boarding the gangways. That same policy applies to scooters. That same policy will apply to buggies. That same policy will apply to other goods and items that's brought on board the bus. So it's entirely consistent. We are also, and we were doing this before, the issue arose at the last committee, been in the process for some months now, recruiting a disability and inclusion officer. And we've been working closely with LNER, the train franchise, around how we do that, because they successfully did that about 12 months ago. And I've had a number of meetings with myself and my team, with the Managing Director of LNER, and we're actually in Newcastle next week, spending a day with their current Disability and Inclusion Officer, who's a partially sighted young guy who's really making some positive changes, not just in consultation, but actually getting out and, you know, riding the network of trains. So there's a lot of things happening. You might ask how we're going to implement that, because that's change again, and, you know, how we make people aware of that. So there's a programme, and it's quite an accelerated programme. So come autumn, so the end of August, we will announce the new conditions of carriage. We will announce those 30 days in advance, and we will circulate those out amongst user groups, normal social media channels, etc. We will then, at the end of September, let those go live. There will then be another further 30-day grace period around that. So customers have the opportunity to come in. They have opportunity to get matters explained to them. Anybody that feels that they may still feel conflict, and this is really about making the customer feel safe about their journey, has the opportunity to get a warrant issued. And this is something that's been developed in the CPT code for mobility scooters. So it's a plastic card that basically says that the user has been assessed by the company, our in-house training centre. They can display that. That's actually a requirement under the code on mobility scooters. We will do the same for wheelchairs, and we will do the same for any parents who wish to bring buggies on. So that straight away removes that conflict. Some items may be larger than the statute requirements, and we still offer those people the opportunity to come in and be assessed. Just because they're larger doesn't necessarily mean they may be refused, but they could be refused, because safety and the means of evacuation for the buses are critical. And if they are approved, we will issue them with a warrant again. So there's a fairly rapid journey in terms of doing some of the stuff, very, very positive. And I also discussed with the convener this week that from next year, we've been working for some time around this, and this, I say, it's a journey around how we include a second wheelchair space in all the buses. So from next year, all double-deck vehicles will have a second wheelchair space. So there's a big message there around inclusivity. We only need to provide one by law, so that second wheelchair space will be available for the carriage of other items. That includes goods, that includes buggies or prams. It will be fitted to the same standards, so it will have a rearward-facing pad. The buggy would have to be secured appropriately with side-facing securing. So there's a real plus around that, I think, in terms of wider accessibility and meeting some of the requirements of our customers. So everything that comes in going forward, double-deck-wise, will be like that. We've got video. Yeah, so there's a short video I just want to show you just to demonstrate actually around these vehicles and perhaps destroy some of the misconceptions. There's no saying so. So that's a demonstration. And as I say, we know there's many different sizes of wheelchairs, there's many different sizes of pushchairs and buggies, but the changes to the condition of carriage will define that under the legal requirements that are driven. Thank you, convener. Thank you, committee, for allowing us the opportunity to come and speak to you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Before I take questions, I'd like to jump in on a couple of points first, particularly in relation to some of the reference to myself in the presentation there. I personally welcome a lot of the forward movement that is represented by what you've just been saying. I was particularly intrigued by the driver's guide and the conditions of carriage, because though we discussed it Tuesday, I haven't actually seen those. And I think it would be of enormous benefit for both myself and indeed the rest of the committee to actually see those when they're ready, because it would allow us to read through them, be reassured ourselves, and more importantly to reassure those people out there at the moment who currently have a lot of concerns about how they interact with whatever they bring, whether it's a buggy or a wheelchair or whatever, onto the thing. So I would welcome that. I think that's a direct request from the committee. I think that we would get sight of those and find those very helpful. I presume not for wider distribution, but we'd certainly use them in our work in terms of responding to residents. The second thing, though, that I'm intrigued by, and it wasn't something that was clear until I was listening to your presentation there, and that was a question about these sort of warrant tags. Because you mentioned that buggies will be included. And I was a bit intrigued by that, because I wasn't quite sure from your presentation whether or not you expect that everybody who comes on with a buggy has to be assessed, because that, to me, is an unworkable solution to this. So what are your real details around that for us, please?
Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear, Convener, but the point was that actually buggies meeting the size requirements will not need to be assessed. Buggies that exceed the size requirements will need to be assessed, as would a wheelchair. If what we were saying is that the buggies that fit within those size requirements, so if there's a young parent who is perhaps nervous about using a bus, they're nervous about the interaction with the driver, and they fit within the size requirements, we're more than happy for them to come in and be taken through the process or the procedure. We're more than happy to issue them with a warrant tag for their buggy, which effectively almost gives them unimpeded access, So it's sort of a reassurance point. So it's an overlay only if they wish.
I can understand that working from the point of view of LB and understanding the parameters there. I'm a bit more concerned about how that plays with the public, because I think there has to be a really clear understanding made about which buggies qualify for free passage, so to speak, and which will need that degree of reassurance and that degree of issue. And that's something which I think as part of your communication with the public will have to be made extremely clear. Because I can't imagine that most young parents' first priority will be to rush down to a centre to get themselves assessed because they might have an issue with the buggy size. So that whole which qualifies, which don't for the free passage on will need to be very clearly clarified.
I totally take that on board, Convener, and this practice is clearly established around wheelchairs and mobility scooters. It's been active for over 8 years now across the whole bus industry, and is commonly carried out. So it's well established. I think you're right. We need to communicate it in a way that's understandable, that's clear, that doesn't increase barriers in any way or perception of barriers. But we're basically taking existing practices and rolling them over into another category. But I think the communication process is key around that.
Can I ask you to switch your microphone off in between the answers and so on? It's just it's to do with the webcam. I still have some concerns about shifting this into a group that do not normally consider themselves required to make that extra effort. And I think that certainly is a concern that's worth noting. Councillor Booth first.
Thanks very much, Convener. Thanks very much indeed, Richard and Jim, for coming along today and your presentation. And I would certainly echo your comments about how highly valued Lothian is. It's a really important part of our city, and it's one that we value. I'm sure I speak for all committee members that we highly value Lothian's place within the city. But the reason that you're here is because occasionally slip-ups happen, and I suppose I'm keen to understand how we, as the major shareholder, can help you to address slip-ups and ensure that they don't recur. I think on the specific point of the warrant, I share the convener's concerns about that, and if the space requirements are the same as my colleague Councillor Arthur compared when he took his tape measure to Mothercare, I think that is a concern, but perhaps that's something that Councillor Arthur might want to take forward. In terms of the specific issues that the motions, and it was Councillor Mayne's motion, but it was actually a composite motion between Councillor Arthur and Councillor McInnes as well, and I think reached cross-party unanimous support. So I would welcome seeing the detailed written response that you've sent on to the convener, if that's possible to be circulated to the other committee members as well. I think that would be helpful. I just want to pick up on a couple of points. Could you just clarify, prior to the introduction of the Enviro 400 XLB, what consultation took place, either with groups representing disabled people, such as the Access Panel, or groups representing parents and carers? And while I welcome your mention of a Disability and Inclusion Officer, can you clarify what wider consultation you will do in future to ensure that groups such as disabled people, such as parents and guardians, have an opportunity to comment before you introduce changes?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Booth. Thank you for your positive comments and questions. So if I can start in terms of the first point. So the first basis is legislation. So we have to work within that legislative and legal framework that we sit in. The Disability Inclusion Officer, it will be key. So, that will be somebody who will lead with groups and organisations. And that's not just about accessibility. That's about everything around inclusion in our business. And that's a key thing, because future transport networks have to be inclusive as much as they can. In terms of, what we have been doing historically and what we will do in the future, will it significantly change? Not massively in terms of, who we consult with. We consult with a large number of groups. We work with WizKids Scotland, in terms of developing policies. They've been actively involved in our driver training programme this year. So that's called I'm Not Just a Driver. So this is about getting drivers to understand, actually, they're really valuable in terms of what they do, not just driving the bus. And the whole driver training module this year focuses on how they feel, but also how they deliver service. 60% of that driver training module, and I'd welcome any member of the committee to come down and be put through it, because I did it myself. Indeed, the deputy leader of the council, Cami Day, came down and experienced part of it a few weeks ago when we did our open day. That talks about, how we board wheelchair users, how we board buggy users, some of the challenges that are not only mental challenges, but physical challenges around boarding. And a lot of that is how people feel and how people perceive. We're also working very closely with a lead partner with Transport Scotland on developing Scotland's accessible transport framework. And we're well in with that process. I think, in terms of how we talk to groups, well, we talk to people all the time. We have high levels of engagement with our customers, and it's always a question of consultation, how much consultation, what level of consultation, and do distinct user groups or individuals feel they've had consultation. We can't consult with everybody. What we are doing is evolving a product on the basis of legislation, on the basis of all customers' safety, and about delivering future transport products. Though, I think clearly we understand in this occasion there were opportunities that were missed in terms of doing better consultation with those wider groups, and there's lessons that can be learned from that and delivered in the future.
Councillor Booth.
Thanks, Camilla. Thanks very much for that answer. That's helpful. So do you agree that in order to achieve that wider and better consultation in the future, that one way of achieving that might be, for example, to set up a panel consisting of disabled people and parents and guardians to ensure that you can consult with them before changes are made in future?
It's a great point, and you've almost given me the answer. So one of in the job framework for the Disability Inclusion Officer is about setting up a multi-user panel, and that's about all those things. So that's about informing and consulting, and providing this ongoing dialogue. There's never been anything like that in Edinburgh before. You know, actually, there's nothing like that in structure in the bus industry. So we've taken some real lessons out of what rail is doing. Rail is very, very advanced in terms of things like that and delivering positive benefits for it, and I know we can.
Now, forgive me if I've got the order wrong, but I think it might be Councillor Burgess next. Did you have your... No, you didn't? Okay, I did get the order wrong then. In that case, I think, is it Councillor Arthur next, followed by Councillor Bird? I think that's correct, yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for coming along today, both of you. In your introduction, Richard, you mentioned that you'd sent a letter to the convener in response to her letter to you. My understanding that letter takes the form of a private communication. Would you be willing to make that public?
Yeah, I've responded directly, privately to the convener on 4 points. There is a wider context in terms of the whole letter. The convener wrote to me on some other matters within that. I'm happy to discuss that with the convener outside the committee and agree a way forward on it.
Excellent.
In that case, I think just, if you don't mind, I'll interrupt you at the moment and give you a chance to come back in on that. I think what I'll do is really just provide the responses to committee at this stage. It's worthwhile getting it on the record. There were 4 specific questions that emerged out of the motion, which were then subsequently contained in the letter that I sent to Richard and the company. The first one was, what consultation does Lothian undertake with passengers and disability groups for introducing a new bus design? Obviously a topic that we've already covered to an extent today. And the response on that was, again reflected in the conversation today, that the direct consultation with the public was not happening on introduction of new bus designs, but that there is close work with organisations such as WizKids, Guide Dogs Scotland, RNIB, as well as Transport Scotland, around the implementation of Scotland's accessible transport framework. The second question that was asked was, what is Lothian's policy on the provision of separate spaces for wheelchairs and buggies? The issue, as clearly demonstrated today, is that that's an ongoing process, no current policy, but clearly, you know, the work that's been described this morning is relevant to that particular thing, that particular progress. The provision of a dedicated wheelchair space is a legal requirement with which LB comply fully. The third question was about the number of buses entering public service with Lothian and what proportion had separate spaces for wheelchairs and buggies. I understand that in that 10-year period that was being covered in the question, that there were 542 buses purchases, of which 287 had 2 spaces available. One of those spaces, as was described in the presentation, legally required for a wheelchair, and the other provided for a variety of uses, carriage of materials or buggies, etc. And then the fourth and last question was really that was emerging from specifically from our discussion and from the presentation that was provided by one of the deputations, is that would Lothian Bus consider putting in place a public meeting hosted by themselves with representatives of passengers, parents, older people, disability and any other relevant groups to discuss the key questions as outlined. And I think you feel that that's not an appropriate move at this point. To paraphrase, if you don't mind, to paraphrase what you've written here, it's not appropriate to facilitate discussion on these matters primarily driven by statute legislation, risk reviews, public safety and technical parameters. Now, if I might be, and I apologise, Councillor, if I'm sort of jumping in ahead here, my concern around that last answer, and I only got this in very late last night, so I haven't had a chance to discuss it really with anybody else in the committee. My concern around that answer is that, whilst I understand from your point of view the sense of that, it doesn't meet the unmet demand for discussion that's coming from a number of sources, some of whom we heard at last month's take. So, sorry, if you'd like to come in.
Thank you, convener. That was really helpful, and articulated the answers we gave. The point Councillor Booth made aptly around user forums and stuff. That's absolutely the way we intend to take this forward. It's probably wider, and I didn't answer it in the response, trying to sort of stick to the point of the committee's questions, was that there's a number of bus user groups throughout the UK, and indeed in Scotland. And you know, the Edinburgh Bus Users Group, eBug, which was set up about 12 months ago, we've been working on closely. We would welcome continuing engagement with them. We might see that as a facilitation method for further discussions. There is also Bus Users Scotland, who's been long established and is part of a wider UK bus users group, who are very apt at dealing with that. We actually use them as our appeals body around complaints. So if customers are not satisfied with responses they receive, they're used as a independent appeals body. And Greg McKay, who's the new director for Scotland, I've spoken to him and he'd be more than happy to facilitate dialogue between groups and the business, if required, though. As I said, the modus that Councillor Booth described very well is the modus we intend to sort of work with going forwards. Thank you, Convener.
Now, I'm sorry, I need to jump back to Councillor Arthur because I did in fact interrupt his question, and then we'll come back, I think, after that to Councillor Bird, Councillor Cook. Anybody else wanting to jump in after that? Right, thank you. Councillor Arthur.
So thanks for all that detail, both Richard and Councillor McInnes. It's quite interesting. And I think the end of your comment to Chaz, Councillor Booth earlier, speaking about how you recognise that perhaps there's more you could have done in consultation here. I think, personally, that's a statement that should have come out much earlier in this process. And I think possibly we wouldn't be sitting here today if that had been issued with clarity. I mean, I spoke to members of your board, and they were absolutely clear that they didn't think anything should have changed. And so I welcome the fact that you've come along and said that today. But you haven't said that when some of the points that were made in the presentation, particularly the point, the short video you showed with the chap in the wheelchair, I think it was a gentleman, and the lady that came on with the buggy. I find that very misleading because there's 1.3 metres allocated for the wheelchair. And what you've done is you've squeezed the wheelchair into one end of that space so you can get the buggy into that shared space, as you call it. And that is attitude which is fundamentally at the core of this problem, because in these new buses, wheelchair users and people with buggies are fighting over that space. And that's the situation where one of my constituents, a chap called Rab Hallett, he was in the evening news, he was left sitting at the side of the road with his kids and his wife as bus after bus went past him sitting there. I was actually speaking in Oxgangs Primary School last week or the week before, and I brought this issue up. And the kids could not believe that happened to that guy. And that tells me, what I think we all know, is what's been happening here does not reflect the values we have as a city as a whole. So I welcome the fact that you're talking about 2 wheelchair spaces going forward. But the reality is, you've just spent quite a lot of money buying all these new buses. And in a lot of ways, they're not fit for purpose. And it's not just buggies. It's about access for people who have got wider mobility problems. I've got a constituent who's got a sight problem. He's got significant concerns about them. Concerns which have not been answered by Lothian Buses, despite 2 emails to you guys. So there's wider issues here. And on top of that, we've got these used buses which Lothian Buses have bought. And again, these don't meet Lothian Buses' aspiration to have space for a wheelchair and a buggy together on a bus. I know you say it's not policy, but on your website, you do have that aspiration. So I think what I'm saying is as well as this recognition that, yes, things could have been better, I think we also have to change the culture here as well. And coming to my question, now that I've got that out of the way, I think the conditions of carriage review, I absolutely welcome that. But what you're saying is you're going to publish that 30 days before, and then people can look at that before it goes live. What I would ask is that there's consultation on that. And I would ask that you meet with the people who have been raising concerns, which are probably mums, people with disability problems, so they can speak to you before that is finalised. Because that's the discussion that we need. You probably watched the webcast. We had a fantastic mum coming here, representing quite a large group of people, and she raised significant concerns about what would happen. So I think, as an organisation, what you should be doing is speaking to these people to make sure you get your conditions of carriage right. Because what we don't want is the kind of situation which Councillor McInnes outlined, whereas people are having to apply for tags to get their child in a wheelchair or their child in a buggy on a bus. I'm not sure that's what we really want unless it's absolutely necessary. So what I'm saying is what we need is more consultation, and that consultation has to be meaningful.
think the points are well made and they're noted. When I began my introduction, I used the phrase listening and responding. And that's what we will do as a company. And I think it is significant. We've pioneered and innovated in many ways. We're the only bus company, I think, in the UK that has a police liaison officer, for example, to deal with antisocial behaviour. I don't know how many other bus companies will have disability officers. That is a commitment that we've made today, and it'll be that person's day job to have the kind of dialogue that you've just described.
I know I, for one, certainly welcome the decision to go with a disability and inclusion officer. I think it's a very important step. I think clearly it's something that I think the committee might be interested in at a later date to really discover how well that's worked and what benefits that's brought to those particular user groups who have been highlighted through this set of discussions. I think that'll be a very useful addition, and it's something I think you should be applauded for. Certainly.
So the question is can you bus users be involved in a consultation around the condition of carriage?
As I indicated, the accessibility officer's day job will be to have that dialogue on a continuous basis. And as Richard's already indicated, engagement, we support the formation of the Edinburgh Bus Users Group. I find it frustrating as the chair of the company that we carry 3.5 million passengers per week, and often the views of our passengers are crowded out by other more vociferous voices. So yes, we will have that engagement in many ways, and hopefully through the future development of an Edinburgh Bus Users Group.
I think, sorry, I'm going to come in on this particular point because I think it's not a question of vociferous voices being drowned out. I think it's people who are bringing forward issues that underpin progress. And I think what has arisen and arose at our last committee, and this is why I feel free to comment on it, we had an excellent presentation from people who came here to express concerns. Now, you're right. I mean, I consider myself an able-bodied person. When I get on one of your buses, I have no issue at all. I get on, I use the service, it's wonderful. However, I also recognise the fact that there are others who require a different experience, perhaps, or who require an engagement with the company to reassure themselves that that progress is being made. So I think it's the fact that this has emerged, it's emerged through this particular channel. It's emerged in letters to yourselves as company. It's emerged through forum like the Edinburgh Bus Users Group and so on. I think it's an indication not that that there is a balance to be sought between passengers like me and passengers that represent those groups that are bringing these concerns forward. The two things are mutually inclusive. It's about delivering a service for the whole of the city. I would like to make a suggestion, and I hope I would get the support of the committee here. We had an excellent deputation at last month's meeting. I would like to suggest that inside the chambers here, that I facilitate a meeting between that deputation and a couple of others that have expressed interest to us, and directly with yourselves, so they can hear from you the degree of progress that you're applying to this and the direction of travel, and to facilitate that discussion. It could be a one-off. It simply is a good basis to start with, and I think we'll try and get that done as quickly as we can, because I think that would satisfy the committee that there is further progress and that there is engagement with that, because I think that's one of our key concerns. Is that a fair summation? Yeah. Okay. In that case, we'll go ahead and try and put that in place.
Convener, just one very final point, because I believe my comment may have been misunderstood when I made reference to the Edinburgh Bus Users Group and the comment about vociferous voices. That was not at all and should not be regarded as a comment about those who appeared at your committee last month in relation to the petition. It was a comment in the wider context of buses, bus passengers competing with road space with other users.
I think I think we clearly have expectation, I think, from the committee that we'll try and put together some kind of meeting with yourselves. I hope we'll get your agreement on that. We'll find the right time and place, and we'll find the right partners to introduce into that meeting. But I think it's vital that that takes place, and that we have an opportunity to, as you say, as I said earlier, for you to display the degree of progress and response in a way that will help to get that word out to those particular users. Now, Councillor Arthur, did you want to come back in, or has it been covered? Okay. And I think we've got... No, Councillor Bird standing down. Councillor Booth is not, as usual. Sorry. I didn't mean standing down from the committee. I meant from asking the question. I was not signalling a by-election, I can assure you. So I think the next on the list is Councillor Cook, followed by Councillor Booth. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. Thank you both for coming along. It is appreciated, and I mean the professionalism and the level of detail in the presentation is just what we've come to expect from you guys. So I don't think it's a question that anybody does question intentions or Lothian's commitment around inclusion in the broadest sense. But it's not just simply the case that a mistake has been made in terms of the Enviro 400s that sort of misreads the demand and what's come to be the expectations of a pretty vocal part of your customer base. And there's been a lot of talk about legal requirements in terms of people with disabilities. They're important, but I don't think a company the stature of Lothian Buses and the way it's regarded in the city should be happy with meeting those standards. I think there's an expectation that it's such a good company and it provides such a good service that it should always seek to go beyond the minimum requirements. So do you accept that partly because of your success and your positive reputation that is an expectation which has not been met? In terms of the permit scheme, my baby's 9 months now, but I think that's completely unworkable. And I do have a bit of an issue with, not an issue with, but an observation in terms of Councillor Arthur's research when he went to Mothercare. And he focused on a small collapsible buggy, which is actually for an older child. But for me, the issue here in terms of the accessibility of the buses is actually particularly for newborn children. If you've got a toddler or a slightly older baby, you can more acceptably and more conveniently collapse a small pram, and the baby, the child is in a safer and more convenient position to sit on your knee or sit beside you. The issue here, I think we're actually talking about is very, very young babies, and the issues it poses around them. And as I'm sure we all know, the number of prams that are available is huge. Quite how you're going to take a further consideration in the bus access when you're purchasing a pram, and also how you would actually get to the assessment with a very young child is an interesting question as well. I think that's a complete non-starter. I'm not familiar in terms of procurement and the details that go on in terms of the purchase of new fleet, but where alternative internal designs actually shown to you and considered in terms of the layout of the buses that had a larger space for prams, and were those designs discounted in favour of the internal layout that went ahead?
Thanks, Councillor Cook, for your comments and observations. You're absolutely correct about young babies, and that's actually, a growing area of patronage in the business. And, the devices used to carry young babies are generally cot-type devices that cannot be collapsed, in any way. And that's one of the challenges, how mobility is increased for young parents and carers, which is great, actually, because they're getting out earlier, they're using public transport, and they're getting out within the city. In terms of making a mistake, I wouldn't use terminology as strong as to say to refute that, but, I don't think, we have made a mistake, because what I've tried to articulate today to the committee is that we're on a journey. And there's a number of elements on that journey, and the next big step is next year. So we're trying to sort of, meet a challenge around legislation, around bus design, around customer requirements. And there's, as the convener articulated, there's lots of different customers that we need to be cognizant of. and it's about meeting all those requirements at the right level. Now, one or more of those user groups might sometimes think those levels are not correct for their group. That's a challenge, you know, it always will be. If that element could have been designed into that bus, it would have been one of the key challenges, and that's why I pointed out that the dog seat, for the accessibility dog seat, has been the introduction of that seat in the last 12 months in legislation, and that has proved really difficult in reciting where an additional bay would be. We've found a way through that now, and in future buses that will be taken care of with an additional space, which I think is good news.
Councillor Booth.
Thanks very much, Convener. Temporary problem with the microphone there, I think. I share Councillor Cook's scepticism about the issue of the warrant card, and somebody has responded on social media to ask how, if they need to get their buggy assessed, how will they get their buggy to the assessment centre? Is the obvious question. But I hope that we can resolve these in the dialogue that the convener set out. And I welcome the fact that you're here today and that you've shown a willingness to engage in that dialogue. So thank you for that. I think it would be remiss, since you're here, since you're on the public record, can I give you an opportunity to apologise publicly to AAA and Rabi's trail burners for what I think was acknowledged to be a childish prank over the number plates, and can I ask for an assurance that such a prank won't happen again?
I issued on behalf of the company. Let me take it back slightly. When the matter was first drawn to my attention, I said I would look into it. When I did, I took the view and had the conversation with Richard that the use of these plates were inappropriate. Subsequently, I issued a very full letter to the Managing Director of Rabi's Trailblazers. I apologised unreservedly. I also challenged Robin Worsnop that if he genuinely did have evidence of bullying or harassment, to provide that. And I also made a couple of other observations. First, that as a company we were perfectly entitled to re-enter the coach and the contract hire market. It's actually in our shareholder agreement with the city, which also obliges us to act as commercially as possible. So there's a market opportunity in our line of business. It's fair for us to go for that, and as a council you would expect that of us in other circumstances. And my final point to him is that in re-entering that market, I would expect the company to behave with integrity. And I also indicated that behaving with integrity also should involve having respect for our competitors. So I'm very happy. Some of you, I think, have received copies of that letter, and I'm very happy to issue a copy of that letter to the rest of the committee, and I would regard the words that I've made to be the public apology that you have been looking for.
Do we have any further questions from the committee? Councillor Arthur.
Firstly, just so a question for Richard and then a question for Jim. Just to be really clear about the two wheelchair proposal, will that apply to any second-hand buses you apply? Will they also be compliant with that?
You talk about new second-hand purchases, for want of a better word, yeah? Yeah.
You bought second-hand buses from London, I think, which now run in Edinburgh. I think there's problems with these buses in terms of accessibility, the spaces. So will the two-wheelchair policy apply to any second-hand buses you buy?
Interesting question. There's a two-tier response to that, Councillor Arthur. It's unlikely, given the proposals on the table currently around LEZs from the council, that we will be purchasing any second-hand buses in the future. You know, emissions technology will drive fleet renewals and fleet replacement. There's the last batch of ex-London vehicles are coming into service as we speak, and they actually have an increased space. So they have a defined legal wheelchair space. They also have a increased space on the offside of the vehicle where other goods, including a buggy, could be carried.
Yeah, and the question for Jim, just a quick one. I mean, Councillor Booth rightly touched on the issue of the number plates, which has been a reputational issue for the Lothian buses. This accessibility issue, I think, has also been a reputational issue, and there's been other issues over the past year. Has this been a bad year for Lothian buses?
I would accept, not over the past year, but over perhaps the last couple of months, we have had adverse publicity as a company. We cannot control how we're reported, but I came into Lothian Buses back in 2015. I didn't apply for a job. I came in at the request of the City of Edinburgh Council to help out with problems that the company was experiencing at that time. As you will all probably remember, a very serious and irretrievable breakdown in the senior management team. So I came in with a remit to resolve that, which I did, re-establish shareholder confidence, provide business continuity, restore morale within the business, and begin the process of succession planning. All of that has happened. And during that time, the company has continued to prosper, and we've enjoyed very, very good press relations, part of the open ethos that Richard has encouraged. So therefore, I believe that adverse publicity to be a setback, and I've reminded Richard and the team that as a publicly owned business, we have to set standards that some other private operators may not apply. We need to act with integrity at all times, and that's my commitment.